Hi, Anita, and hi, Rick. It's very nice to see you today, and I want to welcome you to the Wicked series. Rick, it's your first time, so welcome to
Thank you
the
for
Wicked
having me.
series. And Anita, it's always nice to see you. It's not your first time, but it's always nice to see you. And today we're going to be talking about something that is interesting. We talked a little bit about it in one of our episodes, but today it's again on an inquest. We'll talk a little bit more about what they are generally, and we'll then get a bit more specific because there is an you two worked on one inquest and there were some interesting issues in there. And so we'll get to talk about that. But we'll start, first of all, by talking about what are inquests in general. So whoever wants to jump in and just give us a general idea about what they are.
Maybe should I start because I'm older, Rick? Is that okay?
And
Um,
ladies first.
Ladies first, okay. And Rick, jump in any time and correct me if I'm wrong. But an inquest proceeding is an administrative law proceeding. It's an inquiry held by a presiding officer who's usually a medical doctor, which is weird. That's the coroner. Sometimes it's a lawyer now when there's legal issues. That's a recent amendment. There's also a jury who is the trier of fact. And the juries, something funny about juries at inquests, and Rick will agree with me, is they get to ask questions like of every witness. They are like another party with counsel in effect. So they just get to ask whatever questions they want, which makes inquests really unique that way. And there are parties with standing, private interest parties are usually family or police who are involved, people involved with the death directly. And then there's public interest standing that's available. And that's where Rick and I often come in. We may represent families, but we often represent public interest parties. And really, the inquest does two things. At the end of the day, the jury has to answer five questions. That's discharging its fact finding mission. So the jury must determine who died, when, where, how, or by what means, and the manner of death. And the manner of death is they have to choose between suicide, homicide, accident, natural, or undetermined. And then they don't have to, but they can, if they wish, make any recommendation to prevent future death in similar circumstances that arises out of the inquest. And they're encouraged to make reasonable and practical recommendations. So the inquest is a bit of a different process than we're used to as criminal defense lawyers. It's unique, but that I think is pretty much what I would say an inquest is. Rick, anything to add?
Nothing to add other than the unique role that a jury plays. They're able to ask questions, like you said. That I think is um, unlike other proceedings, obviously, but it's also a good way to keep the conscious of the community involved in an inquest when there's a person who dies. Have a voice from a jury to ask questions that lawyers may not think about and that the presiding officer may not think about.
And just for clarification purposes, it is a jury, but is it a jury of 12, like in a criminal proceeding? Or what is the number of jurors for an inquest?
Five
Fine.
jurors.
Five.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to clarify that, so it's five. And what types of deaths trigger an inquest?
Rick, do you want to take this one?
In my experience, construction, that's where a person dies on the work site. And the work that Anita and I do is primarily where a person dies either in the custody of police or in the custody of a jail or a prison.
Okay. All
Right.
right. So yeah, go ahead, Anita.
There are two kinds of inquests, right? Mandatory inquests where there's no
Hmm.
discretion and they must be held. And those, a big chunk of those are the construction deaths. So whenever a construction worker dies, there has to be an inquest. It doesn't have to be a long or a complex inquest, it might just be a few hours or a day. And then if you die in police custody, and that sometimes there's debate around what it means to die in police custody. And so sometimes when people in crisis die and are shot or killed by police, it's not entirely clear whether they were in custody to trigger the mandatory nature of an inquest being called. And then we're left with inquests can also be called in the discretion of the chief coroner, and they may determine that they're going to hold an inquest even if they don't have to. And that's where families of the deceased come into play often, and organizations. Black Lives Matter, for example, advocated very vigorously in favor of an inquest into the death of Andrew Loku, which is, I think, where Rick and I met when he was in the fifth grade, I think, roughly.
Just the uh, first year summer of law school, working with now presiding officer Selwyn Peters.
All right. So then let's focus more on the inquest in the case where the individual dies in the custody of the police, because this is more what you guys have been working on, not the construction one. So let's let's talk a little bit more about these types of inquests and what are some of the issues that that get into play.
I'll start, and I'll give one example. One of the kind of big issues that we see in terms of how we really ensure the jury is able to first answer the five questions and two,
Mhm.
consider recommendations, and that's the scope of an inquest. And the scope of an inquest is what the presiding officer, the coroner, decides is the appropriate scope is the best word, the appropriate scope of what is to be looked into. So in the inquest, the Andrew Loku inquest, one of the things to look into was the intersection of mental health and race and how that may have impacted the police decision making on that day. And so, I mean, one, that's unique, and two, that's where Anita and I come in our capacity as counsel for the public interest groups, is that we're able to push for what we think. We look at the facts from our lens and think about how best to ensure the scope properly reflects the facts and properly reflects how best to ensure that deaths like that don't happen in the future.
Yeah, so scope is definitely the starting point of these inquests, and um, before the inquest even starts, there are sometimes debates among the parties, and there'll be meetings to discuss how we're going to define the scope.
Mhm.
So one of the issues is that in the past, um, the conflict arose if the coroner's office wanted to keep the scope of the inquest quite narrow, just to the moments surrounding the death, for example. How could that death have been prevented just in the moment, as opposed to going back to look at what services maybe should have been provided to the individual to keep them out of the path of police and go beyond the circumstances of the death narrowly defined. So there, defining the scope is often an issue. Institutional parties like police officers, police union, police chiefs, sometimes the board might want to narrow the focus as much as possible to have a shorter inquest, fewer things to probe at, fewer recommendations for change at the end of the day. Whereas public interest parties like Rick and I represent often want to broaden the scope so that we can seek more systemic recommendations from the jury for sort of more active, more enduring, more sort of aspirational change and systemic change.
And I wanted to ask you guys, is the ultimate goal of an inquest to get recommendations, or is this something that is not necessarily the ultimate outcome? Because like in a jury trial in a criminal case, it's we want to get to eventually whether the individual is guilty or not guilty. So, but in the case of an inquest, what is the ultimate goal or remedy that we're looking for?
Rick, why don't we address maybe if you want to start? There are two things that are often contentious, and manner of death is sometimes something that we argue about.
Mhm.
Maybe I think Rick can best address that right out of the gate, and we can talk about recommendations after, I think.
Yeah. Um, Manner of death is usually not all that contentious. Um, Accident, usually it's pretty easy to tell if the person's death was an accident or not. Suicide, oftentimes is able to tell if it's an accident or not. Homicide, generally in police shooting cases, where a police officer deliberately shoots a citizen, a civilian, and causes that person's death. That's a homicide. Um, which two am I missing? Undetermined usually is not there. But to Anita's point, in the Emmanuel Ortameka inquest, he was a gentleman who died in police custody in Thunder Bay. He was arrested for suspicion of being involved in robbery, brought to the police station, seemingly unconscious. Police thought he might have been playing possum, but he was not responsive, and it turns out that he was in a health crisis. Um, in that case, I argued a lot. I was on the inquest for the family of Mr. Ortameka, and I argued strenuously that it was a homicide, that it was police in action to look at him, see him in crisis, see him unresponsive, and to take no steps. That's deliberate. That's not an accident. And the other parties, the police parties, argued it was an accident, and the jury ultimately found that it was undetermined. And so something like that is powerful because it shows again the conscience of the community looking at the facts saying, I can't tell you, as a majority of the jury, I can't tell you this was an accident. I also can't tell you this was a homicide. I just don't know. And things like that are important because they show to the police service, they show to the public, one, these deaths aren't going to be pushed under the rug. And two, the community will ask you questions and say something like a person dying from a drug overdose, which Mr. Ortameka ultimately died from, something like that should be pretty easy for us to inquest. We should be able to figure out the manner of death quite easily. But when it's police action interfering with that, we may not be sure. So before we get to what recommendations we push for and whether or not we want recommendations, the first thing is we need to be clear about what the manner of death is and make sure it speaks truth to what actually happened and we don't just kind of push under the rug as one of the 5 questions that need to be answered.
And sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Anita.
What's so interesting about what Rick has just said is undetermined is sometimes a loss for families and public interest parties, but sometimes it's a win. So sometimes if you can get the jury to say undetermined, that means that they consider that homicide was as much potentially the manner of death as accident or natural causes. So I just want to take a minute to give you a little bit of history and background. It's easier when police shoot with a gun and kill someone. It's easier to make the case for homicide. But even then, one of the sort of popular responses from policing historically has been trying to get the manner of death as suicide. And we saw that in Yatim. We saw a motion by the officer involved to suggest that Sami Yatim wanted police to shoot and kill him, and it was suicide by cop. And so that was a very, very contentious motion. But historically, if it's not a shooting, another way that people in crisis frequently die in the hands of police is through positional restraint or positional asphyxia. So you've got officers on the back of someone who's face down on the ground, they're handcuffing them in the back, and they stop breathing. So for many years, the advocacy by policing interests was to try and class that either an accidental death, a natural death, to look at the heart. The person had an enlarged heart. Maybe they had a genetic problem with their heart, as if to suggest they would have died in that moment of their heart condition, regardless of the positional restraint. And those are cases where we would advocate for a homicide verdict. It was the actions, the intervention by police, the actions of those officers that caused the death. So that it not always, but sometimes manner of death is extremely contentious, and people are goal oriented about their advocacy around that.
And some of the high profile inquests have been because of the manner of death being contentious, right? Like, I mean, the team inquest was all about that. But I wanted to ask you guys, in the case where the verdict or the jury decides that it was a homicide, so is it possible then to have criminal charges laid in that case against the cops, or like, can it go further? And can it lead to a homicide case, a criminal case?
We're both smiling. I'll let Rick take this one. That's an easy question for you, Rick.
It is. Inquests, you can't lay blame. And that's one of the main functions of an inquest is they're not about laying blame. They're not about pointing fingers. They're about ensuring that we prevent deaths moving forward. So no matter what the finding is, there's no criminal liability that attaches to that.
In the inquest, but afterwards, like, can the Crown then um, decide that they want to lay a criminal charge?
Well, we hope so. Um, we certainly hope so. The Ficuri inquest, which was not a policing inquest, but was a
Mhm.
recent inquest, which we talked about on
Yes.
YouTube. The hope there was, the correctional officers involved in that death had not been charged prior to the inquest. At the end of the day, that death was ruled a homicide,
Yeah.
and the hope would be that there would, at least be an opportunity now to revisit the decision whether or not to charge. So, although it doesn't carry liability or assignation of blame in the same way, and there's no mens rea that was proven or anything like that, um, you would think that in the face of a homicide verdict that was contested, there may be consideration given to revisiting
Yeah.
whether or not charges could be laid.
I just want to add to that, just from the Ortomeka inquest. There, at the inquest, for the first time, some information came out about what the police officers knew about Mr. Ortomeka's condition, when they started having concerns that he was in a medical crisis, differences between what the officers told the jury versus what they told the investigator who decided not to lay charges. So things like that, I hope factor into the Crown's mind in exercising the discretion in determining whether or not a charge should proceed to trial, or for police to decide whether or not an arrest should be made.
Okay. So we will get now eventually. I do want to get into the more specific aspect of policing and individuals in crisis. But before that, just can we briefly cover the other aspect, which is the recommendations? Because the first thing is determining the manner of death that we just covered, but then the recommendations. We talked a little bit about that when we were talking about the Fakiri inquest, but now just in general. So what are some of the recommendations, and is there a limit as to how many recommendations the jury can make in these types of cases?
Yeah, sky's the limit. I'll
Okay.
start this one off, Rick, if that's okay. So when you're acting for a public interest party or for family, you want not necessarily as many as possible, but as useful as possible, as meaningful as possible recommendations for change. So the smart lawyers and the inquest specialists, and I want to stop for a second just to say there are not a lot of lawyers who practice before in these proceedings, and it is a very unique forum. So anyone who's thinking of getting involved in inquest litigation, talk to Rick, talk to me, get really familiar with the process because it's unlike any other. You've got at least a dozen lawyers, a lot of parties, and you have to collaborate. If you're a lone wolf and you can't play well in the sandbox with others, you're not going to get anything for your client. And you have to work sometimes with, for lawyers for interests that you don't agree with at all. You got to come together for the purpose of building these meaningful recommendations. That will only work if you collaborate. So, you got to have some charm. You got to be a charming person to work well in inquest. Anyway, the good lawyers come in with a list of recommendations before we've heard any evidence at all. Here's my wish list. And the good lawyers are open about it. Here's what my client is seeking to get at the end of the day. You don't hold your cards close to your vest here and then try and get people at the end. Because in order for the jury to make the recommendation that you want them to make, you have to have evidence in support of it. The jury can't just pull recommendations out of thin air. So it's our job to make sure that there's some evidence before the jury to allow them to make certain recommendations. Whether we are going to call witnesses to allow them to make those recommendations or through our cross-examinations. And you have to be collaborative because if you get the other parties on side, they might present a witness for you or present a document for you that'll provide an evidentiary basis for the kinds of recommendations you want the jury to make. So come in with what you want and make sure you get the evidence for the jury there. So, public interest parties that are looking for systemic change, they're the change makers. And there will be resistance to that type of recommendation. And then the last thing I'll say about recommendations, I hand it over to Rick, is, at the end of every inquest, after we conclude the evidence, there will usually be a day or two's break for all the parties to sit down and hammer out a joint slate of recommendations if we can, so that we can all go to the jury and say, we all endorse this list of recommendations. And then the parties can go on their own. And in a recent inquest, Rick and I, his client and my client, went off on our own and asked for three other recommendations that the others involved did not support. And we persuaded the jury to give us those recommendations. And that was, a solid win for us. But so there's this time to come up with language. And that time is heavy duty negotiations, because Rick and I want to say, fund these services, take away their guns, give them SOG bullets, don't give them tasers, whatever we want to use that language. Government wants to say, consideration should be given to striking a task force who over time will look at and perhaps, make recommendations to us about change that could happen late. You know what I mean? So that's the tension, and that's what we're negotiating. Over to you, Rick.
I couldn't have said it better. That's exactly it. I always want to get recommendations from a jury. I always think there is something to learn from the facts of a death. And that to do that, we need to figure out, how can we actually prevent this? We can't just say, oops. Like, we really have a goal of zero deaths. So every inquest, I think we need to have strong recommendations that actually target the systemic issues. We don't just point fingers at an officer and say, this officer themselves has biased views and that's all we need to fix, and then we move on. This wouldn't have happened. We know a lot of these issues are systemic, and so I always want a recommendation to address systemic issues, and I want it to be broad as possible. The benefit of having the public interest organizations is that they come with a lot of knowledge. Obviously, Anita, you and Jennifer have a lot of knowledge. So any particular fact of an inquest, you can look at it and say, what are the systemic issues here? This aren't just the set of facts that have before me, but it's the experience of, I can identify what went wrong here, even when the police can't. And the same applies for BADC, for the Black Action Defense Committee. Mm-hmm. They have decades of experience dealing with anti-Black racism, dealing with addressing systemic racism in policing and governments, through advocacy, through litigation. So we rely on all of that, and we say, how best can we craft recommendations to make sure these things don't continue to happen? We've seen the pattern for decades. We know the path forward, and we know we're not heading there in the right direction without these recommendations. And having these recommendations means we can follow up with the stakeholders and say, look, 2016, the Andrew Loku inquest said, or the Andrew Loku jury said, to do these recommendations to prevent death like this in the future. Where are you at with it? What's going on? Why are we not doing this? It's a priority for us. And so always, at least from my view, we want recommendations.
All right. Yeah, go ahead, Anita. Do you?
No, all I wanted to say is, and I know there's a lot of sort of public concern about what's the use of these recommendations anyway, because they're not enforceable by their very nature. They're not self-enforcing. Well, one of the things is, if a jury in the Loku inquest made certain recommendations to set up an advisory comprised of members of the Black community to review policing policy on interactions with people in crisis, to make sure that anti-Black racism training is taught, that there, and then the next Black person in crisis gets shot in similar circumstances after those recommendations were delivered to the policing service, and they were aware of it, and they had an opportunity to respond and change. That's going to be a problem for them, because at the next inquest, we hold up that recommendation from Loku and say, well, you were told how to prevent this death. You killed this man anyway. Why didn't you do what you were told? So that's, I think, motivating for a lot of the services. And to be fair, a lot of the services have been incredibly responsive to inquest jury recommendations. Another thing I think we should talk about for a second is how exhausting it's been for decades to attend these inquests at the local police service one at a time, and then have to go through it again when another person dies in similar circumstances in another city or town. And what solution we think we found in the Akamba inquest that we did together recently. Because this has played out throughout the province. Like, I've been going around for 30 years saying, why don't you try de-escalating? How about you talk nicely and calmly to people? I said it in Windsor. I said it in Kitchener. I said it in Oshawa. I said it in Hamilton. I've said it in Toronto, and it's exhausting. Like, why can't we just say it to all of them, right? Rick, what happened in Akamba?
Canva, kind of sua sponte on the own motion of the juror, asked the presiding officer, can we make these recommendations apply to all of the forces in Ontario?
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Eden, I believe it's Dr. Eden, had no issue with that. And several recommendations were made to all police forces to say, look, we don't need to go one by one and identify whether or not these issues exist in your force. We know by their nature of being systemic that they exist in your force. So let's address them all at once rather than doing this kind of Mickey Mouse one by one, trying to figure out what
Yeah.
the issue is.
Yeah. Well, that's good though. That's a good thing because then many of these issues are common across cities. So it is a good thing if you can save, and having several inquests for the same thing. So, but then let's just get now into policing and some of the problems that we have, because I mean, there have been a few high profile cases where the inquest was or the context of the death was because of policing and the interaction between police and specifically individuals who are in crisis mode. And I know, Anita, you have a lot of experience with that because you serve, I mean, this is your niche practice. It's individuals who deal with mental health problems and who are often in crisis. So let's get more specific about that and just tell us about some of the issues and these types of inquests. And they must be very heavy, I can imagine.
So all inquests are incredibly sad. I think Rick
Yeah.
will agree with me. You don't come out of an inquest, joyful or happy.
Yeah.
They're emotionally taxing and traumatic experiences, but some will hit harder than others. Some will be,
Mhm.
extremely difficult, just based on the footage you have to watch. I mean, I was involved with one inquest where we had to dozens of times, if not hundreds of times, watch, Michael Elegon being shot by, being surrounded by 12 or 13 uniformed officers with their guns out, and him in his little hospital gown and naked otherwise in the dead of winter. Some of the stuff is really, really difficult when
Yeah.
there's video and there's, dash cam videos and so on. But anyway, so they are difficult. Um, I will say, I've been doing it, and I've acted for Canadian Mental Health Association, for Advocate for Children and Youth over the years, many different organizations. But most often, I act for the Empowerment Council, who are systemic advocates for people with mental health and drug use issues. And they've been at the forefront of this since the 1990s. So, my involvement started, I think, going all the way back to Edmund Yu or around there. And the weird thing is things repeat. So Edmund Yu was an Asian Canadian who was holding a little hammer. He was on a Toronto bus. And cops went on there and shot and killed him, even though he was just in crisis. Fast forward 2013, Sammy Yateem's on a streetcar with his little knife. They don't get on the streetcar to shoot him. They shoot him from outside the streetcar. And you stand back for a second. You think, what the hell? Why didn't we learn from you that if someone is isolated, they can be contained? And how about just shutting the door of the bus or the streetcar? I mean, really, the difference was that it was a streetcar, not a bus, and 30 years had elapsed or something. Um, so you see the patterns that you see. I think ultimately in your team, we had a good conversation about what is the problem underneath it all. And Rick can speak, I think, much, much better to this, but ultimately it's police and culture. Ultimately, the police and culture that wants to contain and control and exert power over a person by any means. Historically, this has meant yelling, screaming, and the expectation that people would follow commands. And the police command or the police challenge is, drop your weapon. Police, stop, drop your weapon. And people in crisis they will not process in the way that is expected to land. So they will not be responding. They've got competing things going on. They're scared. If you've got a gun in their face and they think you're going to shoot them, they're definitely not dropping their weapon, right? Because they're scared. So police and culture needs to change, and that the inquests really have focused on um, disengaging, de-escalation, learning how to um, to employ a completely different approach. Um, and that's been really the main theme up until your team when a new layer has been introduced, which is okay, how do we prevent? So another theme has been how do we prevent the person being in the path of police in the first place? We need community services. Okay, but if we can't prevent them landing in that interaction, how do we inform the training of the officers so they don't start by pulling their gun in someone's face and shooting them if they don't drop their weapon? How about we give them some time and space and try to disengage and de-escalate? And if that doesn't work, then by a team we rolled around to bystander or peer intervention, which is if you've still got a cop who's not going to put down his gun, looks like they're going to shoot and kill someone that we know they don't have to kill, then what is the responsibility of the other officer and the other officers who are there to intervene and stop it? Like that's like a stop last resort measure. I'll stop there.
Rick.
I'll kind of add my thoughts to that. I hope I talk
Mm-hmm.
in order generally. Policing culture is toxic. I am very critical of policing culture because it really is so hyper focused on police safety to the exclusion of so many other things. It's not a practice or a culture that's trauma informed. They treat any aberration from absolute compliance as that person's being defiant. And then when you ask questions like, do you think he might not be able to hear you? Do you think the person might have been in crisis? They don't think that. They're thinking, I said, put the gun down, put the knife down, put the hammer down. I was loud, I was clear. Surely you heard me. And so I take it as an act of aggression. And that has been at least in my experience, has been a problem that has persisted. Policing culture needs to change. It needs to be trauma informed. It needs to, as Anita was talking about earlier, maybe don't yell at the person that you're trying to get compliance from. Yelling never helps, whether or not you're in crisis. Yelling at a person who's not in crisis is not an effective way to obtain compliance. And that's ultimately what police want. If they're talking about safety, they want a person to be compliant. They want to apprehend that person and deal with that person without the use of force. But going in the way they do with the current culture has been a failed experiment, $1 billion per year failed experiment that we need to move away from. Which leads me to the second point of we need to reconsider how we deploy police and what that looks like. That was discussed at the Canberra inquest, where studies were introduced and surveys were introduced from the Peel community about reconsiderations of what we let police do and how they respond and where we put our money behind. They had one, I think at the time of the Canberra, they had one unit over a period of time during the day that would respond to people in crisis. They didn't have 24/7 services. And so police had to respond to this, and that's not what they're trained to do. So policing culture on its own needs to change, but we also need to divest from policing and invest in non-policing alternatives to respond to people in crisis. It also talks about use of force. I mean, we know for sure across the country, people of color are facing disproportionately victims of uses of force. And we see this in pretty much all jurisdictions. I think York Regional Police might be the exception with their most recent data, but we see this all the time. And we're tired of collecting data. We don't need to collect this data to prove that we see this disproportionality, and we need to take real meaningful steps. And part of that is, first, again, I'll say it again, addressing the policing culture, making sure that we're employing a trauma-informed approach, and really taking away from police the responsibility to have to deal with certain calls. Yeah, I'll leave that there.
Let me,
Oh,
sorry, Maya, I'm just.
no, I just had a question because Rick, I mean, you do also a lot of criminal law. So just on that, because we know in criminal law we have this concept of racial profiling that applies now, and that is recognized by the court. So does it have any? Does it come into play in inquests and policing?
Yeah, it does. I will give one example, and again, it goes back to the Ortameka inquest. And Mr. Ortameka was arrested Police were looking for a Black person who was in Thunder Bay. The officer testified about what steps he took, that he saw a Black guy and he assumed I would have arrested any Black guy who was in the neighborhood. I was just looking for a Black guy.
Mm-hmm.
He writes in his notes, Negro male, describing this Black guy. This is 2014.
He actually wrote that in his notes?
He wrote
Okay.
that in his notes. He was under cross-examination. He was aggressive. He was combatant. He didn't want to talk about racism. He showed to the jury, I think, quite clearly that first, racism in policing is still alive and well, and that there are senior sergeants and staff sergeants in the police forces who do not see it, and we can't expect the sergeants and the constables who they supervise to really be attuned to it if the higher ups aren't.
Yeah.
And the other thing about Ortameka is the first thing that the jury saw at the inquest was the video of what happened to him being dragged out of the back of a squad car through the Sally Port into the booking hall, laid prone on the ground. Police are having a good time talking about everything else. Their backs are to him, no care whatsoever for him. And I think for the jury seeing that before hearing from any other officer, and then the evidence we heard about anti-Black racism in Thunder Bay and from these particular officers, I think that shows, first, we still have a long way to go, and two, again, racism is still well and alive in police.
Yeah,
and it
unfortunately.
doesn't need to be an officer who goes ahead and calls him a Negro male. It doesn't necessarily, it's not the retired chief of police who testifies and says, well, I don't know if Negro male was appropriate in 2014. I can't recall sitting here today. I think the jury sees these things and says, this is not the community that we should be aspiring to be. There are changes we need to make. And the jury did an excellent job looking at the evidence, thinking about recommendations that are really targeted and are designed to make change.
Anita, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, Rick will recall. It's not like in criminal law where we can simply start with the presumption that coroners can take sort of, coroner's notice or tribunal notice of anti-Black racism. It's been very difficult, long road to get race introduced into the scope of these inquests, and it's to the great credit of Batsy and Rick's clients and Rick himself and Selwyn that who've really, pushed hard to get these conversations on the table. I recall that at Loku, we weren't allowed to say race or racism. We had Dr. Kwame McKenzie, who's a Black psychiatrist, who was going to talk about institutional biases that were race-based. His article had the word racism in it, institutional racism, I think his article was called. And we were told that the only time we could use the word race or racism was referencing the title of the article. So I remember drafting a 5-minute cross-examination that only used the title of the article. You wrote this article, Institutional Racism. And in that you discuss institutional racism. And it's institutional racism, but anyway, eventually Sullivan got that move. But it's been a long, long road, and things are much better now. We're able to introduce into the scope the anti-Black racism that drives. It's a preponderance of people in crisis who are shot and killed are Black. And 30 years ago, we were going through the list of people who'd been killed, trying to identify how many and who was Black, because we didn't have the race-based data. But Rick will recall, recently we did the inquest into Mark Akumba's death. Having the conversation with individual frontline officers about race when they're on the stand is excruciating. We asked these officers questions like, Mark Akumba opened the door when you knocked. Yes. And he was a Black man. I don't see race. Remember? Oh, I don't see color. I'm colorblind.
I think it was all the officers who had responded testified in the exact same way. I don't see color. It made the presiding officer say, are you saying that kind of rhetorically, or can you not see color? Because you can see that my coroner's counsel are racialized, correct? And the officer says, yes, obviously. But it is really that resistance to that kind of that old thinking of, oh, I don't see race, and that's the best way to approach it. It shows a deficiency in the training and efficiency in the knowledge of police on the road. Maybe the recruits are getting better training. I think the recruits are getting better training, but the officers on the road really think I don't see color is an appropriate way to address anti-Black racism.
Yeah, I mean, it is just also, I mean, it's just a matter of being honest, right? I mean, like, what do you see when you're just like,
No, in that
it's just,
inquest, didn't we have the coroner say like, "What color am I? And what color is my counsel?" Then like, these conversations, it's just yeah, there are real problems in policing, and at these inquests, we have to be able to explore them.
yeah.
And police officers have to be made aware of the preponderance of Black men they're killing, particularly in crisis. And if they don't get taught that, right? Like if they don't get taught, if you're the individual officer on the road, unless somebody sits you down and says, "We've got a problem. We're killing all these Black men when they're in emotional crisis," and we have to stop that, and that's why we're talking about it. Then they can just say, "Look, I don't know, because I'm colorblind." So that's where all the education comes in. And it is things are moving in the right direction, but again, it's due to the aggressive advocacy through these inquests and by every means available of organizations like BATSI, lawyers like Rick, lawyers like Selwyn, and the Empowerment Council, Jennifer Chambers. I mean, it's been a long road and a difficult one, and it's such an important one. Is it making a difference? I don't know.
Well,
That
yeah, go ahead,
Just
Rick.
to add to that, are 2 points. The first point, kind of going a little back to the local inquest about the fight we had to be able to use the word racism to talk about the concept of racism. Race was fine. Racism, I mean, the submissions about it from counsel for the police or from the police service was, I'm not comfortable with the emotional content of the word racism. And I think that is emblematic of what the issue is. It's worse to be called a racist than it is to be racist. It's worse to identify racism and racist actions than it is, it might as well just take a step back. We've seen since 2000 to 2023 that 57 Black people have died at the hands of police. 20% of those have been in the last 5 years.
Mhm.
That does not seem like we're heading in the right direction of getting to the point of zero death. I think we're heading in the right direction of training. We're heading in the right direction of appropriate recommendations and progress in general, but we're still seeing the issue. And I think we're still seeing the issue because a lot of the culture has remained the same. And police, again, in terms of dealing with people in crisis, are not well equipped. There are others who are much better equipped. Even in the Andrew Loco inquest, there were neighbors who were trying to de-escalate the situation before police arrived, and they were doing a great job. They were talking to him, they're trying to calm him down. He had a hammer in his hand, he wasn't swinging it at them. He was engaged in a respectful conversation with them, and police showed up, yelled at the top of their lungs over and over and over again until they shot him. Police dropped the weapon, police dropped the weapon, and his 2 officers in the hallway yelling at him. And he starts walking towards them. He's talking to them. They can't hear him because they're just yelling at him, comply, comply, comply. And your failure to comply, I'm going to shoot you. And that's what happened. And so we are heading in the right direction, but comments about the emotional content of the word racism, the sheer number of Black people who are dying at the hands of the police ought to be of concern to the police services, the police board, and the unions.
We
And
saw
so,
that. We saw that in your team, Rick. We saw that in your team. The streetcar driver did fine with Sammy team. He said, "Is there anything I can get you?" Sammy said, "Can you get me a cell phone? I want to call my dad." And they had a perfectly calm conversation that was de-escalating. Police got there, and within seconds, Sammy was dead. So police have a way of escalating these situations,
Mhm.
whereas ordinary citizens who just say, "Look, are you okay? How can I help? What's happening? What's the problem?" And just before I forget, in terms of trying to get police out of these situations, in terms of crisis response to people
Yeah.
in crisis, it's very, very important. And from my client's perspective, from the Empowerment Council's perspective, sort of two police officers in uniform with guns, terrible response. Police officer with a mental health nurse in uniforms, sirens screaming, also not great. No uniforms, no sirens, no lights, maybe better. But most of the people who have serious mental health issues who've lived with them their whole life, they've had traumatic experiences of being involuntarily detained in hospital and forcibly
Mhm.
treated against their will in hospital. So they don't want to see the psychiatric nursing or the mental health clinician either because they're pretty scared of being forced to go to the hospital as well, which is why Toronto has done a really good thing. We've got, I think, four teams. There's a pilot project afoot and is being expanded in Toronto, which is crisis intervention services that are community crisis intervention services. So it's not nursing and it's devoid of police. It is people who are specifically trained in crisis intervention. It's often peers, people who have their own histories of being in that spot and having mental health issues, who are specifically trained in de escalation and crisis intervention. And if you can get two people from a community crisis intervention team to attend, most of these situations do not require police. If there is
Mhm.
an active weapon involved, maybe police need to be there for
Yeah.
safety. But there are many ways to involve trained crisis workers, even on the phone, giving advice to the officers. So that's a positive direction in which we're trending, certainly in Toronto, that I would hope to see roll out throughout the province.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, these are people who have more experience and who are more trained in terms of trauma and traumatic situations, as opposed to police, where that may be a bit lacking, at least for now. But hopefully, there will be, if police are still to be involved, then we hope that they will receive more training on trauma-informed interventions. So, well, I want to thank you so much, both of you. This was a really interesting conversation, and I'm sure that a lot of people who don't do a lot of inquests will find this very, very interesting and very informative. And I wanted to thank you for your time because you're also doing a lot of work in this area, both of you. And I know you said we're not where we would like to be yet, but with your work, we will, I'm sure, get there or close to what you aspire to. So thank you so much for your work and for your time.
Not a problem. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having us, Maya. Rick is the future. Rick is one of the most talented, brightest, hardest working, incredibly effective counsel at these inquests that I've ever seen, and I'm proud to say I knew him when. So he's going to change the world one
Thank you so much.
inquest at a time.
Thank you
Well,
so
and
much.
then we'll have you again, Rick, as a guest to tell us more about these inquests.
I have an inquest in November, December-ish this year that I think will involves again another Black person who was killed in custody, who was killed by police. So I expect after that there will be a lengthy list of recommendations and hopefully some progress for some police forces
Yeah.
across the province.
Also, we'll definitely keep an eye on this and hopefully we'll hear from you once you're done with that inquest as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.